Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel, Get Cozy, or welcome if you're new here. In today's video, I am doing another installment of my series 1 ink and 9 pens. In this series, I am testing one of my fountain pen inks and all of my fountain pens at the same time. The idea behind this series is for me to be more adventurous with my ink and pen pairings because I tend to find a pairing that I really like and I stick with it for a long time without really switching it up. And I have found that by doing this series, there have been a lot of surprising pairs that I wouldn't have thought to pair otherwise. And so today I am doing Iroshizuku Shin-ryoku. And the reason I wanted to do this ink today is because I've had this ink for almost a year and I just haven't used it very much. I found this ink to be pretty underwhelming in its color, and so I'm really hoping today that I find a pen that I really can appreciate this ink with. The reason I have this ink is because last year my husband and I went to the San Francisco Pen Show, so this was end of August 2025, and there I got my very first fountain pen, which is my Pelikan M150, and my husband also got a fountain pen at the pen show. So we got a couple of inks. This was one that my husband picked out, and I thought that the green striped barrel on the Pelikan would look really nice with this ink color, but I just felt a little bit underwhelmed by this ink, and I haven't really used it very much. So in today's video, what I'm going to be doing is I am going to tell you a little bit about this ink. I'm going to fill all of my fountain pens on camera with this ink. They are all empty, clean, and ready to be filled with ink. Then I'm going to do some writing samples on camera on 3 different kinds of paper. I also have a dip pen that I will be using to swatch this ink with to see what kind of sheening and shading properties I can pull out of it. And then at the end, I will carefully inspect the writing samples to determine which pen I like the best with this ink. I have my green sweater, I have my green coffee mug, I have a couple of green Pelikans, so I'm very hopeful and optimistic that I will find a pen to really appreciate this ink in. So this is not the first Iroshizuku ink that I have reviewed in this series. I've also done Seongyo and Tsukio. Those are some of my favorite inks of all time. I will link those videos down below, but Iroshizuku is a line of fountain pen inks produced by Pilot that launched in December of 2007. And the motivation behind this line of inks was to break away from regular blue-black inks for writing and to develop colors that are a bit more poetic for everyday writing. And Shin-ryoku came out in the second wave of inks that were launched in the Iroshizuku line. So this ink was originally launched in July 2008, along with 4 other inks. I'll put them on the screen here: Kujaku, Seiyoro, Kirisami, and Fuyu Seiyugun. Iro in Iroshizuku means color, and Shizuku translates to droplet. So the idea is droplets of colors that are inspired by nature. Now, Shinryoku specifically translates to deep green or forest green. It is intended to represent a lush, vibrant greenery of early summer in Japan. To be honest, I feel like this is not like a true deep forest green. It kind of looks like that on the label and also how the ink looks in the bottle. I feel like this ink tends to lean a little bit more blue and cool tone. Now, when I was looking up like the public perception of this ink and seeing if there's really any controversies, there's not a whole lot to say. It behaves similarly to the rest of the inks in the Iroshizuku line. It's very wet and lubricated and glidey. The general consensus is that it is usually well behaved and a really juicy pen on certain papers. There can be a little bit of feathering and bleed through. Also, the shading tends to be pretty minimal. It can sheen. I'm expecting to see some of that sheening with the dip pen here. And I find the color to be a bit divisive amongst people. Some people really, really love this green color, and then others just feel a bit apathetic and underwhelmed by it. So what I have here is a 50 ml bottle of ink. It retails for $20 on Amazon. Some other stationery retailers sell it for about $28 to $30, just depending on where you get it from. And I've talked about this before, but I really like the Iroshizuku bottles. They're really beautiful, so they're nice to display on your desk if you like to display inks on your desk. And the fact that they have this point at the bottom of the bottle makes it easy to fill pens, so I find them really functional. The oval shape makes them a little bit less modular for, storage and packing inks together. It's not really the best shape for that, but really beautiful bottle. I appreciate how big it is. Okay, so next what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to zoom you in. I'm going to fill all 9 of my fountain pens with this ink, and then after that, I will be talking about the papers I will be using for the writing samples. All right, so I have 9 pens I'm going to be filling on camera. They are all cleaned out and empty. 5 of them are Pelikans, 3 of them are Pilots, and I have 1 Kaweco. Let's start with the first pen that I acquired. This is a Pelikan 140. It is a vintage pen. I really like using Iroshizuku inks in this pen. I just find that the nib on this pen, being an oblique fine, can really pull out some cool sheening. So I'm really excited to see how that looks in here, even though I did try it about a year ago. Hopefully my mind has changed a little bit to be more open. So that is, the whole idea behind this video. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to fill the rest of these pens on camera. I will speed it up, and next we will talk about the different kinds of papers. Oh, I forgot. I like to show what the ink typically looks like in the cap so you can get a sense of the color. This is how it looks. Definitely looks very deep in the cap, but do you see on the top of the cap, it looks a little bit more cool toned and blue. I find that that is really what the ink looks like on paper. So really curious to see if we'll see that. Anyway. All right, so everybody has been filled. I am going to wash my hands and then I will be back to talk about the papers for the writing samples. Okay, so let me tell you about the papers I'm going to use for the writing samples. I'm going to start with this notebook. This is a Midori notebook. It's part of their color notebook line. It's not regular MD paper, but I've been using it in my one ink and many pen series, so I'm going to be consistent and use this again. I did a review on Midori MD paper that I posted earlier this week, so I'll link that down below in case you're interested. The second type of paper I'm going to be testing is in this notebook here. This is a Kanzonoto notebook. It is exclusive to jet pens. It has Tomoe River S paper, so it's not like regular Tomoe River paper. It's very finicky, very prone to feathering and bleed through. So I think it serves as a really great test to see how inks behave. And again, I've been using this in all of the other videos that I've done for this series. So I'm going to be keeping it consistent with that. And then finally, I'm going to be using the note pages in the back of my Hobonichi Weeks. It has Tomoe River paper and it is a cream color. So I really like to see how inks perform in here because I use my fountain pens in my Hobonichi Weeks all the time. So those are going to be the writing samples I do on camera. And then lately I have been doing a bonus writing sample in this little notebook here. This is the Nimuzin Maruman paper. It's just like a little, I think this is an A7 size, but I really like testing inks in here as well. And then recently, I got this notebook from Me Plus. I'm going to be talking about this in an upcoming video next week, but I have been testing different inks in here. They have a couple of different papers that they carry as refills, so I'm going to also be doing a bonus writing sample on here as I'm trying to get to know this paper. So I will talk about these at the end. Anyway, so let me zoom you in and we will do some writing samples on camera. have it, 1 ink, 9 different fountain pens, plus a dip pen on 3 different kinds of paper. Now, this ink confused me a bit, in which I will talk about why that is in a minute. So I ended up doing quite a bit of writing samples to try to wrap my head around it. So first things first, whenever I'm trying to identify a pen for an ink that I like the best, these are the different criteria that I'm thinking about. And I've talked about these in my other videos in this series. So the first is thinking about how fluid, wet, and lubricated the ink feels coming out of the pen. All the pens felt really great. I do think that the pilots tend to write a little bit more on the dry side, so maybe not as glassy smooth for those pens. For my juicy writers like my Pelikan M800 and 1000 and 120 with the broad nib and the Pilot Custom 823, this ink felt like glass coming out of those pens. Super, super smooth. So really great writing experience overall. The next thing that I look for is a feathering, ghosting, also bleed through. So we'll take a closer look at the writing samples for that. I also look to see what the shading and sheening properties are like, and then finally saturation. Now, the other thing I'm looking at that's really confusing me about this ink is the color. I feel like I can't get a sense of the color. Sometimes it looks very deep green, sometimes it looks more blue, so I'm going to also be talking about that when I get to the saturation. But let's first talk about these other criteria. I'm going to look at the Midori paper up close and we can get a good sense. Here's how the writing looks. So this top section is with the dip pen, and then we have the Pelicans, the Kaweco, and the Pilots. I would say that this paper does tend to have a tiny bit of feathering, and the lines here are not the most crisp, but they're pretty good. I'm not really seeing like a lot of issues when it comes to feathering. Even on the juicier pens, it doesn't really seem to vary that much. The ghosting is very minimal. Even with the dip pen, I would definitely use the back of this page to write on without a problem, and no bleed through at all. So that's really great to see. And then as far as sheening and shading goes, sometimes it can be dependent on the paper. On this paper, I do see some shading characteristics. It's a bit of like that watercolor effect, but the range of light to dark is not super dramatic, except for maybe the first pen. You can see that in Pelikan M120 writing sample. The E, the top of the K, and the top of the A are quite a bit lighter. So definitely some shading, depends on the pen. The Kaweco Lilliput, the Kakuno, and the Decimo have less shading. And on this paper, I'm not really seeing any sheening. As far as saturation goes, the Kakuno, the Decimo, and the Lilliput are probably the least saturated. The M800 and M1000, I would say, are probably the most saturated. So let's talk about the Tomoe River S paper. Okay, here's how it looks up close. With the dip pen, there's definitely some feathering issues. I've seen this with the other Iroshizuku inks that I tested on this paper, so definitely this paper is prone to feathering. And then as far as the writing samples go, again, the lines are not super crisp. There's definitely more feathering on this paper, pretty much across the board. The Decimo has the least amount of feathering, I would say, but it's also the lightest and least saturated. And then let's check for the back. I would say the ghosting here is pretty heavy. I would not use the back of this page, and there is some bleed through from the dip pen. As far as the other writing samples go, we're getting pretty close to having some bleed through with the Pelicans and the Pilot Custom 823. So definitely not performing as well in this paper, kind of across the board. There's definitely some shading. We see that for the 120, the 140, 250 doesn't show as much shading. There's a little bit for the 800 and M1000. Not a ton for the Kaweco Lilliput or these two pilots. And the Custom 823 has a bit of shading as well. And again, on this paper, not really a lot of sheening. And then as far as saturation goes, definitely those juicier writers, like the Pelikans and the Pelikan M250, way more saturated than the Kaweco and the Kakuno and the Decimo. Ignore this gray line here, that's from a highlighter. On the Hobonichi Weeks paper, you can definitely start to see more of those sheening properties, especially where the dip pen is, and in some of the writing samples as well. I would say that on this paper, the lines look the most crisp, very, very minimal feathering. Really no feathering at all, to be honest, even with the Pilot Custom 823, the M800 M1000, and the M120. Okay, let's look at the back. Ghosting is minimal, not really bleed through. There is a bit of more pigment coming through where I swatched it with the dip pen, but it's not quite bleed through, but it's getting pretty close. But other than that, looks great on the back. I would definitely use the back of this page. Also, there is quite a bit of shading going on really across the board. I would say, again, the Kakuno and the Decimo and the Lilliput probably pull out the smallest amount of properties. And then as far as saturation goes, kind of the same story. I think that the juicier writers look way more saturated than the drier writers. So like the Pelikans, darker than the Kakuno and the Decimo. Okay, so I did some bonus writing samples. Let me show you. Okay, so here's how it looks on the Nemosine paper. I just wrote all of the pens on the notepad, and you can see that the lines do look narrower and finer on this paper than the other papers. Nothing about that is new. And then there's a tiny bit of a sheen on the ink swatch here, but not a lot. And then recently, Meat Plus reached out and sent me their slim pad to try out, and they also sent me some of their refills. So they have two different kinds of paper, and I have been exploring those for creating like an ink swatch log. So let me show you what Shin-ryoku looks like. So they have two different kinds of paper. One is Karina paper, and they have another paper called Mini Joy. And I'm going to be talking more about this on Tuesday's video next week, but this is how Shin-ryoku looks on the Karina paper. So definitely you can see quite a bit of sheen. You see that? The ink swatch has like a reddish sheen to it, which I think looks really pretty. I would say it's pretty similar to the Tomoe River paper in the Hobonichi Weeks, except this paper is white and not cream. And then this is how it looks on the back. So very, very similar to the Weeks. I'm still testing this out. I don't have my fully formed thoughts on this paper yet, so I will talk about that in a future video. And then I also have been testing their thicker paper. So this is their Mini Joy paper, and not as much sheening on this one. Definitely some shading. Performs really well. I mean, like no ghosting at all. You can't see it at all. So that's really cool to see. So still getting acquainted with that, but the reason why I have all of these extra writing samples is one, to test the paper, but also I'm a little bit perplexed on how the color looks on different writing samples. And now I've tried it on 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 different papers at this point. Here's my thoughts. So Iroshizuku Shin-ryoku, I've done a video on that. That ink tends to look different depending on the different type of paper that I use. On certain papers, it looks very purple and burgundy. On other papers, it looks more brown. And that really did not vary based on the pens that I was using. And so with this ink, I did notice some differences in color, and definitely I think the paper has something to do with that, because with the dip pen, it looks different on different papers. But I also noticed that with different pens, the color looks different as well. And I think on the Hobonichi Weeks, you can see a pretty good example of this. The Decimo is more of a dry writer, and it is probably the least juicy pen of all the pens. And it almost looks like a blue toned green. And I see that really across the board. Part of it, I think, is it's lighter, so it's less saturated, and because of that, it's making it look more blue toned. You can definitely see some blue tones in the swatch of this ink, and I guess in areas that are less saturated, it's gonna look more blue and cool tone. So seeing that across the board does make me think that the juiciness of the pen is going to dictate how green or blue the color is going to look, regardless of the paper. Looking still at this writing sample across the board, the Decimo is the lightest, and interestingly, the 140, which is another pen that I tend to find to be pretty juicy, it also looks a little bit more cool toned. And with this being my first fountain pen and being my first impression of using this ink, that does explain why maybe I didn't really like it very much, because I just don't really prefer this lighter tone, cool toned green. Now, one thing I wanted to point out about using this ink with the Decimo also is this ink is actually a bit runny. I would say it's a little bit runnier than some of the other Iroshizuku inks. And I say that because the ink tends to splatter. Do you see that? It's like splattering everywhere. I don't know. I'm not really seeing a ton of nib creep with this ink, but I did notice that with this pen, and I do not like that. So I think that between the runniness issue causing this to splatter whenever... Do you see how bad that is? Anyway, so this splatter coming out of the Decimo, in conjunction with how light this ink looks coming out of this pen, really makes me not like these two paired together. I will probably never put this ink back in this pen, to be honest. So my first impression being underwhelmed and apathetic about this color, I think I still feel that way, but there are certain pens where I think it looks the best. The M800 and M1000 stand out to me as being the most saturated, and I do think that the way that the color looks when it's really saturated like this is by preference versus the others. The Custom 823 is pretty close, but it's still a bit lighter than the M800 and the M1000. And looking carefully, their performance is actually pretty similar. Okay, so I've carefully inspected everything and I've made my decision for my favorite pens, two pens to pair with this ink. It is going to be a tie. It is solely going to be based on the fact that these two pens, the ink looks the most saturated, and I think that it gives off the color that I tend to prefer when it comes to this ink. So the Pelikan M800 is one of the two in the tie. Again, I just think that the color looks the darkest and the richest, the most green. So that is one of the pens. And then the Pelikan M1000 is my second favorite. To be honest, they are pretty similar to each other. I can't really tell a difference in terms of their performance or sheening, shading, things like that. They're pretty much identical with this ink, so those are going to be my favorite. Now, this is not my favorite ink for these pens, so if I'm ever in the mood to use this ink, we'll probably go in those pens. I was hoping the outcome of this experiment would help me to appreciate this ink some more, and this ink does puzzle me a little bit with how the color looks. It's just not a color of green that I tend to gravitate towards, but M800 and 1000, most saturated, deepest green color. Those are my favorite pens with this ink. So I am going to leave you there. I would love to know if you've used this ink before. What are your thoughts on it? Do you feel apathetic about the color of green like I do? Or do you really like this color? I would love to know your thoughts. If you like this video, I would really appreciate a thumbs up or subscribe. And with that, I'll see you next time. Thanks for watching. Bye!